Hi, this is William Lee, and this is the Saturday edition of the Romanov Dynasty of Russia, my YouTube series on that topic. And I was able to do a midweek episode this week. I don't know if I'll be able to do it in the coming week because I have a busier schedule, but if I can, I certainly will. So, our topic this week, last time we talked a little about Tsar Michael I, Mikhail, and noted that his sons, only one of his sons had survived. And that son was not declared heir to the throne initially, not until he turned 13. And then even then he wasn't declared heir to the throne. He was simply appeared in public beside his father, which was the way that Michael demonstrated his intention and his desire that he would be succeeded by his surviving son Aleksei. At that time there were no legal stipulations whatsoever on who a ruler could choose as his successor. He was free to do whatever he pleased, although certainly custom was in favor of making one's eldest son one's heir. So when Michael died, he was indeed succeeded by his one surviving son, Aleksei. And Aleksei had a son and then lost that son, and then had a second son whom he also named Aleksei. And then he went on and had more children, both girls and boys. And the ones that would survive would be Fyodor, Ivan, and Peter, and they are all people of note. But the topic today is about the birth of royal children in Muscovy and their education. And I don't have a lot to say on the topic of birth. It's not something I went deeply into when I was researching my dissertation, but I did learn that when a royal child was born to the Romanov dynasty in Muscovy, that the first person outside of the parents, the first visitor to that child, was by tradition a priest. And I don't know if you can even say by tradition, because this, of course, was a new dynasty, and I don't know if the Rurik dynasty had that tradition. I rather doubt it. So in previous episodes, we talked about how the Romanovs started with their own dynastic mythos that was separate from the sort of warrior ruler mythos of the Rurik dynasty, who were descended from Vikings. And the Romanovs had more of a religious emphasis on the ruler as being not just ruling as a result of the divine right of kings, but actually being a representative of God on earth and sort of having a semi-divine status himself. And the Russian state being an emanation of him, more or less. And yeah, so this was distinct to the Romanov dynasty. And this was, in the days of Holy Mother Russia, Rus, Old Rus, rather than Russia. And yeah, so how did this impact the children of Michael and of his successor, Aleksei? So in the case of Michael and his raising of his son, Aleksei's education, Orthodox education, began before his secular education did. So his first visitor as a newborn was a priest, and then his Orthodox instruction began when he was 3 years old, and his Orthodox observance, insofar as that was possible for a 3-year-old to be an observant Orthodox Christian. And the fact of the matter is, actually, with all Orthodox children, that they receive communion on the same day and during the same ceremony as their baptism. But anyway, for what it's worth, we know that that Aleksei's religious instruction began 2 years before his secular instruction began, so at the tender age of 3. And then when he was 5, his father actually chose a secular overseer, a man to oversee Aleksei's education. And this man was a court functionary, I believe, from a boyar family. The boyars were the nobility, and his name was Boris Morozov. And he was, in Russian, you would call him a vaspitatel. So vaspitatel is tied in, that word is tied into the idea of bringing up, bringing a child up. But the person who was the overseer of a Grand Duke's or a Tsarevich's education was called the vaspitatel, and then there were lesser tutors underneath. And in Russia at this time, in Muscovy, those lesser tutors would be sort of seconded from the government chancelleries. And so the earliest educational materials that Morozov and his staff of tutors were using were all religious, were all based on religion. The alphabet, the way Aleksei was being taught, the alphabet was with, some kind of religious association with each letter, and the books that he was learning to read with were religious books. But I don't think that was at all uncommon at that period of time. Across the whole Christian world, I don't think that was at all uncommon. And the fact of the matter is, there were parts, the overall vision of Muscovy was of this sort of state, religious state. But there were within that currents that were pushing for more modernization and more involvement with the West, and that didn't sort of just appear out of nowhere. When Peter the Great started his reforms in the early 18th century, there were currents of that, and some of those currents were within the royal family themselves. And so Aleksei, his son, Morozov has even been referred to as sort of a progressive, not in a political sense, but he wanted his charge to have a proper secular education for a future ruler. And he introduced some materials from the West into the curriculum. I'm not sure exactly which were ones or what kind. And Aleksei actually studied military science, international affairs, government, history, geography, and various topics under the umbrella of science, natural sciences and that sort of thing. So, yeah, that was not at all a bad education, it sounds like to me. And then when Aleksei himself became Tsar Aleksei and had sons of his own to educate, he also turned his sons over to boyar overseers, vaspitateli. When his sons turned 5, they were given boyar overseers. But their real education did not begin until they were 9 years old. I'm not sure why. Maybe life was so short for so many children back then that you weren't considered to be someone with a future until you were 9 years old. But that's just speculation on my part. And in later generations of Romanovs, in the 18th and 19th centuries, that age would go down to 7, and they would have male teachers and male overseers, and would start their formal education when they were 7. So in the case of Aleksei's children, they had their overseers at the age of 5, their male overseers at the age of 5, so a little earlier than more modern Romanovs would have, but they didn't begin their academic education until they were 9. And this is not talking about Aleksei himself, who started younger, but his children when he became the Tsar. So they began their real education at 9, and we have testimony of foreign observers who came from the West and who were at the Russian or the Muscovite court and observing, and apparently those foreign observers were not impressed by the education that the children of Tsar Alexei were getting, and they reported it as being rather primitive, that the children were just learning reading and counting and some of the most basic knowledge that they would need about domestic and foreign affairs. So 2 points to make about that. On the one side, it would have been, in many instances, a superior education compared to the sons of the boyar nobility. And there were certainly boyars who were closer to the court and had administrative roles who were educated people, but by and large, the boyars who were out on their estates they were not receiving or giving their children a formal education. So there was an attempt, at least on Tsar Alexei's part, to give his children a superior education when they were 9. And, it would be an issue that would arise again as far as outside observers scrutinizing the education given to little Grand Dukes or Tsarevichi and saying, this is not good. They're not being well educated for that role. That would actually happen again quite pronouncedly in the 19th century during the period of great reforms. But we're a long way from that as yet. And that was, so in this instance, it was foreign observers. But later on, when it was in the 19th century, it was not foreign observers, it was Russians themselves who were part of this newly emerging civil society and who were speaking their minds and daring to criticize the imperial family, and public opinion at that time was starting to matter. It was starting to count. And as we'll see when we get to that point, the Empress herself paid attention to this, to the criticism that was leveled against the education she was giving her sons, because her husband, Alexander II, had entrusted her with making educational choices for the children. I mean, obviously she was not their tutor or their vaspitato. They had men who were playing those roles, but she was responsible for how that would unfold. So anyway, that's a little bit of a sidetrack. So things changed when Alexei turned 13, and this is so confusing because the Tsar was Alexei and his son was Alexei. And when Alexei Jr. turned 13, he was, unlike his father before him, he was officially designated the heir to the throne. The year was 1667, and his father then took the step of choosing as a new overseer a man who was a real scholar and a real pedagogue, experienced as a teacher and a real scholar by his own right, in his own right. And this man's name was Simeon Polotsky, And again, he was sort of a progressive by the standards of the day. And he himself had been educated in the West. Poland was considered, part of the Western world at that time, distinct from Russia. It was part of sort of the modern European West. And so Polotski had been educated there in Poland, and he was intent on sort of introducing a classical curriculum to his student, Aleksei. But we'll never have a chance to know how that would have worked out, because Aleksei died. And so that left his little brother, who was 8 at the time that the heir to the throne, Aleksei, had died. And so he, Polotski then took over to educate Fyodor. Although he had been appointed specifically to teach Aleksei, the heir to the throne, Aleksei Jr., because he had not been teaching the younger brothers at all. And maybe it was just because they were too young. So Fyodor was 8, so he started teaching Fyodor, and he did not start teaching Ivan, the next younger brother, or Peter, the youngest brother, who would become Peter the Great. And in the case of Ivan, he had some kind of medical condition where he was cognitively delayed, and he was not considered educable. Whether that was true or not, I don't know. But he was almost blind, and he had these cognitive delays that were apparently, fairly severe. And then Peter was too young. Peter was just a tiny little fellow at that time. But what Polotski did do that was quite extraordinary was that he started also providing a real education to Fyodor's sister, Sophia. And so, yeah, that's very interesting, because women had not had any public role up to this time, and they were kept sort of cloistered, actually. And yeah, so Sophia would end up being a very significant person, a very significant Romanov, and one of the most interesting and determined and strong. But we'll find out about that later, and a lot of that is probably thanks to the fact that she was paid attention to by this I have trouble with that name, Polotski. And she benefited from his presence, and she got an education herself. And I don't know if Tsar Alexei was responsible for that. I don't know if that was a request he made of Polotski, or if Polotski just decided to do it on his own. But she got that extraordinary education. Okay, and so then when Alexei died, Fyodor was a teenager. When Alexei Jr. Died, Alexei Jr. had died, Fyodor was 8, and then when Alexei Sr. died, you see why I'm getting confused with this, Fyodor was a teenager, and he became the Tsar of Russia. And Fyodor's health had always been quite precarious. He managed to make it into adolescence, but he was weak and sickly his whole life. And he did end up dying not long. After this, he wasn't Tsar for very long. He was Tsar long enough to father a son, but that son didn't last very long. But in the meanwhile, he wasn't really looking upon little Peter as being an heir to the throne. So Peter was kind of in this gray area, because Fyodor was not a person with robust health. He was not going to live very long. His child didn't make it, and that left Ivan. And Ivan was cognitively delayed, as I said, and blind and handicapped, disabled, sorry. And so, was that compatible with Ivan being Fyodor's heir, when in fact Fyodor's children died, or child? Was that compatible with the role of Tsar? And the answer to that was yes and no. It was completely compatible with the idea of the Tsar being the Tsar being the meek, pious Tsar. That was Fyodor. The image of Fyodor was that image to a T. I'm sorry, no, the image of Ivan. Good Lord, I should redo this, but I apologize, I'm not. I'm so muddle-headed today. And that was not only one reason why Peter's place in the line of succession was a little iffy, but also because Peter was the son of Tsar Aleksei's second wife. So there were two boyar clans who contributed wives to Tsar Alexei. His first wife was Miloslavsky, and that was a powerful boyar family. And Peter's mother was a Narishkin. And the Narishkin, like the Romanovs themselves had been, were more sort of upstarts and less traditional and more sort of modernist. And so there was a great rivalry between the relatives of the first Tsaritsa and the relatives of the second Tsaritsa, and both, of course, wanted to see their candidate for the throne and their bloodline continue dynastically. And so Peter was, just from the time he was little, a boy, robust, physical, in great health, already a little force to be reckoned with. But educationally, he was neglected. So Fyodor did not take an interest in him, and so his education was left up to his mother, and his mother took the advice of, she would turn for advice to the patriarch, the Russian patriarch at that time. His name was Joachim, and he was on the conservative side, but at the same time, Peter was kind of left to his own devices, and if anybody could thrive in that situation, it was Peter. And he was curious about everything and motivated, and he was going to go out and get the education that he wanted and he needed, and he was able to do that on his own. He was able to find the people around him who could help him learn what he wanted to learn, and he never had to be pushed by anyone. He just dove right into it. What does one say? So at any rate, this is all the lead up to, of course, what we're going to talk about in terms not of the education of heirs to the throne, or in a precarious situation like this where nobody knows from one day to the next who the heir to the throne is going to be, because so many people die young and so many children die in childhood. But when we start talking about Grand Ducal education, when there really were Grand Dukes in the 18th and 19th centuries and in the early 20th century, we will have a basis for comparing what kind of education they received and how it differed when the education was specifically for boys who were not going to succeed to the throne. There were enough people between them and the throne that they were not being educated for that role. And we'll see how their education differed. So, thank you for watching. As always, thank you for your patience as I kind of muddled through with with this one, and that notwithstanding, please do come back next time. That will either be on Wednesday or Thursday, and then again on Saturday, or it will just be on Saturday. So we'll see. All right. Thanks. Bye.